The hearing room felt unusually heavy that morning, as though the walls themselves anticipated tension long before the participants arrived. Judge Tanya Chutkan entered with the calm precision of someone who had spent decades mastering the discipline of silence and authority. Her robe flowed behind her like a black veil over a battlefield she had already fought on 1,000 times. Observers murmured softly, sensing that today's session would not resemble any ordinary judicial proceeding. Across the room, Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett sat upright, her posture sharp, her focus unwavering. Despite the formality of the environment, she carried an energy far more dynamic than the polished marble around her, an energy born from years of courtroom experience, activism, and raw political fire. This was not merely a disagreement. This was a collision of principles, personalities, and two entirely different worlds of justice. As the moderator introduced the session, a special oversight debate on judicial accountability, the room settled into a tense but curious quiet. Crockett, dressed in a dark blazer that contrasted with her signature fearless demeanor, tapped her pen lightly against the table. She didn't look nervous, she looked ready. Judge Chutkan, on the other hand, rested her hands gently atop one another, her chin lifted, her expression blank yet impossibly commanding. She was the kind of judge whose silence could overpower an entire conversation before she ever spoke a word. When the floor opened, Crockett leaned forward first. She knew that being first meant setting the tone, and she intended to set it with force. Transparency. Crockett began, her voice steady but piercing, is not optional in a justice system that claims fairness. Americans deserve to know when a courtroom is guided by principle, and when it is guided by pressure, influence, or political calculations. She didn't look toward Chutkan yet. Instead, she let the statement breathe, sink, and land on every corner of the room. We cannot ask the public to trust us if we refuse to trust them with the truth. Judge Chutkan didn't flinch. Her eyes tracked Crockett calmly, with that particular judicial expression, part curiosity, part analysis, part quiet disapproval, that judges used to keep control without raising their voice. When she responded, her tone was smooth but cold, like polished stone. Congresswoman, she said, the judiciary does not operate under the same conditions as the legislature. Your world demands political transparency. Ours demands impartiality, discipline, and order. The public's trust is not earned through commentary or performance. It is earned through the rule of law, and the rule of law does not bend simply because someone demands spectacle. A few people in the audience nodded, others stiffened. Crockett lifted her eyebrows slightly, not in disrespect, but in acknowledgment that Chutkan had taken the first defensive posture. Good, she thought. It meant the judge understood exactly what kind of conversation this would be. Crockett shot back respectfully, Judge, silence is not the same as impartiality, and order is not the same as fairness. Too many people walk into courtrooms without lawyers, without resources, without influence, and walk out with their lives permanently altered, not because the truth wasn't on their side, but because the system wasn't. Her voice softened, but the tension underneath it sharpened. You speak of discipline, I speak of access. You speak of order, I speak of equity, and you may not see it from the bench, but from where your decisions land, those differences matter. Chutkan's nostrils flared just slightly, the first crack in her otherwise impenetrable frame. She straightened in her chair, folding her hands again, as though preparing to slice Crockett's argument with surgical precision. No system is perfect, Chutkan replied, and no courtroom can solve every societal inequity. But judges cannot legislate from the bench. We cannot reshape the entire justice system because individual outcomes appear unfair. Judges must interpret the law, not bend it to emotion or public sentiment. If reform is needed, it is Congress's responsibility, not mine, to build it. This time, Crockett didn't wait. She leaned in, eyes locked directly onto Chutkan's. "And what happens?" she asked. "When Congress tries to fix those inequities, but courts strike those reforms down? What happens when legislative accountability meets judicial resistance? What happens when the people choose progress, but the courts choose precedent? At what point do we admit that the law is sometimes the problem, not the solution?" A wave rippled through the audience, astonishment mixed with admiration. Chutkan's jaw tightened. She didn't explode outwardly. She simmered inwardly, a judge trained to remain composed even when provoked. But Crockett had just stepped into the one area judges rarely allow, questioning not decisions, but the authority behind them. Chutkan spoke slowly, as if weighing each word with caution. "The law," she said, "is not designed to comfort. It is designed to restrain power. Your power, Congresswoman, my power, all power. If lawmakers want different outcomes, they must write clearer laws. Judges interpret what you give us. If you give us ambiguity, we rule within the boundaries we are obligated to uphold." Crockett shook her head. "That's the problem. You see law as something fixed. I see it as something lived. You interpret from the bench. I see the consequences on the ground. People are incarcerated because of inconsistencies. Families are broken because of mandatory minimums. Communities are destabilized because of rulings that ignore human cost. And when we ask why, the answer is always the same. That's the law. Well, Judge, maybe the law needs to be questioned." The tension rose so sharply it felt as though the air thickened. Chutkan finally leaned forward, and for the first time her voice carried a tremor, not of fear, but of restrained frustration. "Order must exist," she said forcefully. "Structure must exist. A society without judicial restraint is not justice, it is chaos. You accuse the courts of hiding truth, but the truth is this: the judiciary protects this country from political storms. We are the last line of defense against impulsive power." Crockett didn't retreat. "And I'm saying the judiciary sometimes becomes the storm." A murmur passed through the room like a sudden wind shift. The debate had officially crossed a threshold, no longer philosophical, no longer polite, but raw, exposed, and personal. And neither woman showed any sign of backing down. The moderator shifted uneasily in his chair, sensing the electricity tightening between the two women like a storm winding itself into rotation. He cleared his throat, attempting to wrestle back a sense of procedural calm. But the conversation had taken on a life far beyond his control. The spectators leaned forward, some clutching notepads, others gripping the edges of their seats. All were fully aware that they were witnessing something rare. Two authoritative minds colliding without restraint. Judge Tanya Chutkan's gaze held firm, but beneath her composed mask irritation simmered. Crockett's words had struck a nerve, not because they were baseless, but because they carried a truth that had always haunted the justice system from the shadows. The law might be blind, but its execution was not. Chutkan, however, refused to allow Crockett's framing to stand unchallenged. "The judiciary does not create storms," Chutkan insisted, her voice tightening. "We weather them, we outlast them, we defend the very foundation that allows dissent, disagreement, and debate. Without judicial independence, your democracy collapses the moment politics overpower principle." Crockett crossed her arms, not defensively but confidently, signaling she had anticipated that argument all along. "Independence," she replied, "is not the same as insulation. I'm not questioning the need for judges to be free from political pressure. I'm questioning whether judges should be free from accountability. You wield decisions that alter lives permanently. You have the authority to interpret laws that elected officials spend years crafting. So yes, you're independent. But independent from what? From oversight, from correction, from public input." Chutkan bristled. "From influence," she countered sharply. From emotional reaction, from whatever trends on the internet this month, courts cannot bend to the public mood. We do not serve popularity. We serve the Constitution. Crockett's voice softened, yet carried more force. And who serves the people, Judge, who defends them when the Constitution is interpreted in ways that harm them, when communities are hurt not by the laws themselves, but by the judicial philosophies behind them? Independence cannot become an excuse to ignore the consequences of power. The judge leaned forward, the slightest raise of her eyebrows revealing that Crockett's words had hit deeper than expected. For the first time, Chutkan sensed her control over the narrative slipping, so she reached for what she considered unshakable ground. "Congresswoman Crockett," she began, "you speak as though judges act in a vacuum, alone and unmonitored, but our decisions are reviewable, our rulings are appealable, and our conduct is overseen by judicial councils. You speak of accountability as if it does not exist. It does. It simply does not exist in the way you want it to." Crockett's lips curled into a faint, knowing smile. She had been waiting for this opening. "Appeals," she repeated. "Oversight councils. You're describing mechanisms so slow and inaccessible that only those with resources can benefit from them. Meanwhile, real people suffer real damage in real time. Oversight is meaningless if only the privileged can access it." A whisper swirled across the audience. Some nodded. Others frowned. Chutkan's fingers tightened around the arm of her chair. "And what is your proposal?" The judge demanded. "To place judges under political review, to let Congress dictate how we interpret laws, to let public emotion influence judicial outcomes. That would destroy the separation of powers. No," Crockett said firmly. "I'm proposing that the judiciary acknowledge what it has refused to admit for decades, that fairness is not a natural byproduct of the law. It must be actively protected, and right now, too many courts are failing that duty." Chutkan exhaled sharply, the first visible crack in her stoic exterior. She leaned back, placing deliberate distance between herself and the table, as though physically rejecting Crockett's assertions. "You accuse the courts of failure," she said, "but Congress writes the laws. Congress sets the sentences. Congress defines the powers we have, and when you don't like how those laws are applied, suddenly the blame shifts to us." Crockett raised a hand slightly, not to interrupt, but to signal she was prepared to dissect that point. "Judge, you're right. Congress has written flawed laws. Congress has passed mandatory minimums that destroyed communities. Congress has allowed disparities to continue. But courts interpret these laws with enormous discretion, and interpretation is where bias lives." She paused, letting the air thicken again. "Judges refuse to admit the role of human judgment in their rulings. That is the truth I'm exposing." Chutkan's voice dropped into a lower register calm, but with a heat at its center. "Bias," she echoed. "Then say what you mean, Congresswoman. You are accusing judges of personal bias in their decisions. That is an extraordinary claim to make." "It's not extraordinary," Crockett replied. "It's reality, and it's been proven again and again. Judges are human beings. They have worldviews, beliefs, blind spots, and those biases shape outcomes. Yet the judiciary acts as though its decisions descend from the heavens untouched by human influence." The judge's eyes narrowed. "You believe judges should confess bias publicly?" "I believe judges should acknowledge that they're human," Crockett fired back, "and that humanity is inescapable. When the system pretends otherwise, the people who pay the price are always the ones with the least power." The moderator attempted to intervene, but Chutkan was already responding. "You are dangerously misguided," she said, her composure slipping a fraction. "Acknowledging human limitations does not mean courts should be governed by emotion. Our obligation is to rise above personal perspective, to interpret the law through precedent and principle, not passion, and that's where we disagree," Crockett said, leaning in again, her voice sharp with conviction. "Because sometimes precedent is the problem. Sometimes principle has been used to justify injustice, and passion is not chaos. Passion is the fire that exposes what complacency hides." At the word hides, Chutkan's expression tightened visibly. Crockett saw it and pressed harder. "You say the judiciary is the last line of defense," Crockett continued. "But what happens when the defense becomes the barrier, when judges refuse to see the impact of their rulings on real lives, when they hide behind procedure instead of confronting the consequences?" Chutkan's eyes flashed, a rare, unmistakable spark of anger. "Nothing is hidden," she snapped. "I have spent my career defending the integrity of the courts, and I will not sit here and be accused of concealment." But Crockett didn't back down. "Then why?" she asked coldly, "are so many truths buried under legal language? Why do so many rulings avoid addressing the human cost? Why do judges pretend their hands are tied when they're not? Why do so many hide behind the phrase, 'It's the law,' when interpretation is a choice?" The room went still. Chutkan's silence was no longer calm, it was explosive. Her jaw clenched, her chest rose and fell with slow, deliberate breaths. She wasn't shouting, she didn't need to. Her anger filled the space like a force field. "Be very careful, Congresswoman," she said quietly, dangerously. "You are accusing the judiciary of deception. That is not a claim to make lightly." Crockett didn't flinch. "And you're proving my point. Accountability feels like an attack only to those who resist it." For the first time in the entire debate, Judge Tanya Chutkan's composure fully cracked. Her voice raised not into a yell, but into a tone sharp enough to cut the room's air in half. "The law does not exist to make you comfortable," she erupted. "It exists to restrain, to discipline, to structure a society that would tear itself apart without boundaries." A shocked hush swept across the room. Cameras zoomed in, eyebrows lifted. This was the moment everyone would replay. Crockett responded quietly, almost calmly, but with a gravity that filled every corner. "And I'm saying the law is only as just as the people interpreting it." The two women stared at one another, one fueled by fire, the other by stone, yet neither willing to look away. The debate had reached its breaking point, and the world outside that room would not forget what happened next. The room held its breath, suspended in the electric quiet that follows an eruption. Judge Tanya Chutkan's voice still lingered in the air, sharp and vibrating like the echo of a struck bell. Her outburst had cracked open a space no one expected, a place where the unspoken tensions between the judiciary and the legislature suddenly felt raw, exposed, undeniable. Cameras were fixed on her face, catching every controlled inhale, every flicker of emotion she fought to restrain. Opposite her, Jasmine Crockett remained poised, steady, almost serene. But beneath that stillness was a kind of fire that had not dimmed for a moment. The moderator, visibly overwhelmed, shuffled his notes and attempted to interject. "Perhaps," he began nervously, "we can shift to the next." But Chutkan lifted a hand, stopping him mid-sentence. "No," she said sharply, her tone commanding enough to pull the entire room back into her orbit. "We will finish this." Crockett nodded, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement. She had always intended to finish this. Judge Chutkan leaned forward, her voice lower now but no less intense. "Congresswoman Crockett, you speak of humanity. You speak of passion, but passion is not justice. Passion is impulse, and if judges followed impulse instead of law, you would not have a just system, you would have anarchy. I fear the consequences of decisions made without restraint far more than I fear being misunderstood." Crockett listened carefully before responding. And I fear the consequences of decisions made without empathy far more than I fear the chaos you warn about, because to the people who suffer from unfair rulings, the system already feels like anarchy. It already feels unpredictable, unforgiving, and indifferent. Her voice softened, but her gaze sharpened. You see passion as danger, I see it as necessity. Without compassion, without understanding the lived reality behind the cases, law becomes nothing more than a set of cold instructions, and cold instructions have broken more communities than you may ever realize. A flicker of something irritation, perhaps even guilt, passed across Chutkan's expression. She masked it immediately, but Crockett had already seen it. The judge sat back, adjusting the sleeve of her robe, gathering her thoughts with surgical precision. "You are assuming," Chutkan said slowly, "that empathy and discipline cannot coexist. You are assuming that judges do not consider human consequences, but we do, we always do. What we refuse to do is allow emotion to override precedent, and that is the difference between justice and personal opinion." Crockett's response came swiftly. "Then, why," she asked, "do so many rulings never mention the human context at all? Why do so many judges write decisions so detached from reality that they feel inhuman? If you consider the consequences, why are the consequences invisible in the written rulings?" The question hit like a stone dropped into a still pool. No sound, but undeniable impact. Chutkan stiffened. She had expected Crockett to be forceful, but not to push the argument into the very heart of judicial philosophy. "Because," the judge said tightly, "our rulings must be based on law, not anecdote. Emotion cannot dictate legal reasoning." Crockett leaned in. "And that's exactly what I'm challenging. That separation is a luxury, a privilege. Those who suffer under the system do not get to separate law from emotion. They feel them together. They live with the consequences of decisions made by people who will never experience those hardships firsthand." She paused, letting the silence underline her point. "You say the law restrains power, but sometimes, Judge, the law is power, and unexamined power becomes abuse." Chutkan's posture shifted. Her chin rose. Her shoulders squared. She looked at Crockett not as an adversary, but as someone demanding answers she was tired of giving. "You mistake restraint for cruelty," Chutkan said. "You mistake discipline for indifference. Judges are not emotionless machines. We take our responsibility with profound seriousness, but we must operate within structure. Without structure, the law collapses. And I'm saying structure without reflection collapses the people." Crockett countered. The audience murmured. A hushed wave of reactions passing like a breeze through a forest. Chutkan exhaled, long and controlled. "You believe you are exposing a truth," she said, "but what you are doing is undermining public trust in the judiciary. When lawmakers imply that courts are biased, corrupt, or hidden behind veils, they weaken the public's faith in justice. That faith is already broken." Crockett answered calmly, "and pretending otherwise won't fix it." She continued, her voice gaining momentum. "People lose faith in the courts when their lives are destroyed by rulings they don't understand, when sentences seem arbitrary, when judges dismiss experiences they've never lived, when the system feels stacked against them from the moment they step into a courtroom." Crockett's eyes locked onto Chutkan's. "I'm not weakening public trust. I'm showing the public why they lost trust in the first place." Chutkan's breathing grew sharper. She tried to retort, but for the first time she hesitated. Crockett seized the opening. "You say I'm undermining the judiciary," she continued. "But accountability is not an attack. Transparency is not an attack. Questioning the system is not an attack. It's a demand from the people you claim to serve." The judge's lips pressed into a thin line. "I serve the Constitution, and the Constitution serves the people," Crockett replied. "When the system fails them, it fails its purpose." A silence fell so complete it was almost deafening. Chutkan finally spoke. but not with anger this time, with something colder, something heavier. "You do not understand what it means to sit on the bench," she said quietly. "You do not understand the burden of deciding cases where every option leads to harm. You do not understand the weight of judgment." Crockett held her gaze. "And you do not understand what it means to represent people who have been harmed by those judgments." The words landed with incredible force. Chutkan's jaw tightened again. "We are not enemies," Chutkan said finally, though her voice betrayed exhaustion. "We serve different roles." "We do," Crockett agreed. "And that's why we must challenge each other, because if we don't, if no one questions the judiciary, then the only people who suffer are the ones with the least power." Chutkan's eyes narrowed. "You have accused us of hiding truth." "Yes," Crockett said simply. Chutkan's composure trembled, not a collapse, just a single unmistakable tremor. "And what truth," the judge demanded, "do you claim we are hiding?" Crockett leaned closer, her voice dropping to a deadly calm. "That many rulings are shaped by the personal philosophies of judges. That impartiality is an ideal, not a reality. That bias exists subtle, powerful, and unacknowledged, and that people pay for those biases with their lives." The judge inhaled sharply, as though the words had hit her deeper than she expected. "You have no right," Chutkan began. "I have every right," Crockett cut in. Chutkan's anger snapped, no longer restrained. "You are accusing the judiciary of deception," she shouted. Crockett did not raise her voice. She didn't need to. "And you're proving that accountability feels like an attack only to those who fear it." A stunned silence washed over the room. Chutkan froze, her mouth slightly open, her breath caught between rage and disbelief. For the first time, she had no immediate retort. Crockett leaned back, her expression calm, almost gentle. "Truth isn't comfortable, Judge, but hiding it doesn't make it disappear." The debate ended not with a gavel, nor with a declaration, but with a silence so profound that everyone in the room felt it settle into their bones. Two women, two truths, two visions of justice, neither defeated, both unflinching, and somewhere in the tension between them, America's struggle with justice lay fully exposed.